My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 48 years old. I've spent the better part of my life building stability, a career I loved, a home I cherished, and a marriage I believed in. I wasn't flashy or extravagant. I valued loyalty, patience, and quiet hard work. But one Thursday afternoon, sitting in my office reviewing quarterly reports, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I should have ignored it. But the voice on the other end made me wish I hadn't answered. It was her, my wife. The woman I had trusted, loved, and built a life with. Her tone was light, almost playful, like a casual phone call between friends. Then the words landed like a hammer. "I've moved your inheritance into my name. I'm starting a new life with someone young who actually appreciates me." She laughed afterward, a cold, cutting laugh that made my stomach twist. Every memory of our years together suddenly felt like a careful mask she had worn to hide ambition and selfishness. For a heartbeat, I said nothing. I let her words sink, repeated them silently in my mind. The anger that should have risen didn't. Instead, a calm precision took hold. I imagined her smug face, the satisfaction she expected me to feel at her audacity, and I realized something essential. The power in this situation was mine, not hers. She believed she had humiliated me. She had no idea she had just opened a door. She went on, gloating about my stupidity and how easily she had taken everything I thought was mine. I could hear the faint clinking of glasses in the background, her golf trip with him, whoever he was, celebrating her conquest. I stayed silent. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. I didn't beg. I simply listened, absorbing every detail. Each word, each laugh, each bragging boast became a blueprint for what I would do next. Finally, I spoke, and my voice was calm, measured, almost unnervingly so. "I know, you deserve it." She paused, expecting a reaction of shock or rage, and then continued laughing, thinking she had won. She didn't realize that my words weren't submission. They were acknowledgement of a reality I had already anticipated, and I had already begun planning my quiet, exact response. Before we hung up, I made a single decision. I would not react in haste. I would not chase her or confront her recklessly. Instead, I would move carefully, gather leverage, and allow the next steps to unfold on my terms. And in that silence, in that calm, I felt the first intoxicating taste of control. The game had begun, and this time I would win quietly, decisively, and without a single shout. The rest of that day passed in a haze, though outwardly I moved through it with careful normalcy. I attended meetings, answered emails, and smiled at colleagues as though nothing had happened, but inside, my mind replayed her words over and over, analyzing the tone, the timing, and the casual cruelty. Every laugh, every careless boast, revealed cracks in her plan that I could exploit if I remained patient. I thought back to the years we had spent together, the late nights managing accounts, the vacations planned together, the moments of trust that now felt like rehearsed acts. I started to see a path she had always been calculating, subtly ensuring she could pivot in her favor if the moment came. What shocked me wasn't that she could betray me. It was how easily I had missed the signs. And in that realization, I found the first spark of clarity. Awareness equals power. I began reviewing the estate and financial records she had quietly controlled. Small discrepancies, little transfers, and accounts I had assumed were joint revealed themselves under scrutiny. I didn't panic. I didn't make calls or send messages. I simply documented, catalogued, and mapped out the architecture of her maneuver. Every hidden account, every proxy name, every weak point in her plan became a quiet opportunity for leverage. That evening, I found myself sitting in the living room with a notebook and a pen, sketching out scenarios. What if I allowed her to believe she had won? What if I collected every misstep, every hint of vulnerability, and waited until the moment was undeniable? The anger I expected to feel had been replaced by a cold focus. Revenge, I realized, was far more effective when it was invisible, untraceable, and slow-burning. I thought about her bank contacts, the lawyers she had called, even the young man she was flaunting in her calls. Every one of them assumed she had the upper hand. And that assumption, that arrogance, became my greatest tool, because the more they believed in her victory, the less they would anticipate my quiet interference. I didn't need confrontation. I needed patience. By the time night settled over the house, I had a plan emerging from the chaos. I would let her feel the illusion of control. I would let her celebrate her perceived triumph. And I would wait. Every transfer she had made, every boastful declaration she had whispered over the phone, had already planted the seeds of her undoing. I simply needed to nurture them, quietly and with precision. The next morning I began my investigation in earnest. I accessed our joint accounts, meticulously cross-referencing statements, transfers, and any sign of irregular activity. Every transaction she had initiated, every wire moved into her name, was a breadcrumb leading to vulnerabilities she had overlooked. I didn't rush. I knew haste would be visible. Patience, however, was invisible power. I reviewed legal documents, past financial agreements, and the terms of the inheritance she had so boldly seized. Each clause, each signature, each notarized page became a piece of armor for me. It was quiet work, the kind that required long hours and careful attention, but I found satisfaction in knowing that every small discovery was a nail in the coffin of her arrogance. She believed she had erased me from the equation. In reality, I was quietly rewriting it. Next, I turned my attention to her bank. Using professional contacts and legitimate inquiries, I traced transfers, timelines, and account hierarchies. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't make threats. I didn't reveal my awareness. I simply collected information with the kind of meticulous discipline that made me nearly invisible in her world. Each discovery revealed not just her actions, but her patterns. The predictable ways she assumed no one was paying attention. I documented everything. Every phone call, every email, every log transfer became a detailed map of her overconfidence. I created separate files, organized by date and priority, each one a quiet arsenal for the moment when her sense of invincibility would meet reality. This was a war waged without noise, a strategy built on patience and insight rather than confrontation or anger. By the end of the week, I had a clear picture. A trail she assumed she had covered, an illusion of security she believed was foolproof. The more she flaunted her control to her friends, her young lover, and even strangers, the more her vulnerability spread like roots waiting for someone to pull. And I would be that someone, silently, deliberately, and without a single word of accusation. That night I sat in the study, reviewing every detail I had gathered. The storm was not approaching. It had already begun, invisibly, quietly, and under my full control. She believed she had taken everything from me, but I had already begun taking it back in a way she could never anticipate. And the thought of her eventual realization filled me with a calm, patient satisfaction, unlike anything I had ever known. I didn't contact her directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I began with the smallest, almost imperceptible moves. I discreetly alerted her bank to irregularities, framing them as automated compliance checks. I knew she would feel the friction immediately, but she would never suspect me. By the time she made her next call to inquire, she was met with delays and requests for verification, small obstacles that sowed doubt in her mind. Simultaneously, I reached out quietly to trusted legal contacts, not to initiate conflict, but to confirm her exposure in case she tried to solidify her claim. Each conversation I had was carefully phrased, leaving no trace of my involvement. Every minor complication she encountered now had a silent, invisible force behind it. Me, and I relished the subtlety, knowing she would never connect the dots until it was too late. I began monitoring her communications indirectly through shared accounts. Her reliance on mutual acquaintances and the small digital footprints she left. I started mapping her movements and intentions. Each detail I observed allowed me to anticipate her next steps. Her confidence was her weakness. Every boastful text, every brag about a new account or transfer became a blueprint for my quiet response. Within a week, I noticed the first signs of stress. She called less frequently. Her messages contained fewer taunts. When I did receive communication, there was a subtle edge of tension beneath her laughter, the faint hesitation of someone realizing the ground beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. I said nothing, never responded emotionally. Silence became my loudest weapon. I also made minor, indirect adjustments to the inheritance channels she had assumed were untouchable. Transfers were flagged, access temporarily restricted by standard security measures, and certain notifications were rerouted. Each small action was invisible to her, yet cumulatively her control was eroding. She was a storm in her own right, yet she didn't know the calm observer at the center had begun to reshape her world. By the end of the month, the shift was undeniable, though imperceptible to anyone else. Her confidence had dulled, her casual laughter had thinned into wary smiles, and I sat in quiet satisfaction, knowing the invisible threads I had pulled were tightening steadily. This was the power of patience and observation, the art of revenge without confrontation, and it was only just beginning. By the second month, her composure was beginning to crack, though she still tried to maintain an air of superiority. Every call she made, every transaction she attempted, was met with unforeseen obstacles, delays, verification requests, unexpected freezes, all seemingly coincidental, yet carefully orchestrated. She didn't suspect me. She thought the world itself had become unpredictable, and in that misperception, her control was slipping. I continued to operate invisibly. Friends, bankers and attorneys were engaged only indirectly, never revealing my hand. Each action I had taken over the past weeks had compounded, like a quiet tide eroding a cliff, until small inconveniences now carried real consequences. The young man she flaunted alongside her was growing restless, sensing her growing vulnerability, and she had no one to confide in who could offer guidance. Her calls began to carry subtle frustration, veiled beneath practiced laughter and forced cheer. She would ask questions I had no intention of answering directly, leaving her to twist in her own confusion. The inheritance, once hers to control completely, had been partially neutralized without a single confrontation, leaving her blind to the truth. She assumed victory, yet every move she made only tightened the noose I had placed silently around her ambitions. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Each call, each misstep, each hint of her rising panic became part of the final picture, not as evidence for public exposure, but as a silent ledger of her unraveling, a reminder of how arrogance and betrayal ultimately sow their own undoing. I didn't gloat, I didn't taunt. I simply observed, letting her carefully constructed world collapse under its own weight. Then came the day she tried to access the largest transfer she had made. The system froze her attempt, flagged for review. Her eyes widened, lips parting slightly, and I could almost hear the internal calculation running through her mind. How could this be happening? Every step she had taken with such confidence was now uncertain. She was powerless, and yet she didn't know who or what had orchestrated her faltering. And in that moment, I realized the truth I had been waiting for. Victory did not need confrontation, drama, or force. Her downfall was inevitable, guided by her own choices and my quiet, precise maneuvers. I leaned back in my chair, calm, patient, and fully aware that the final act was approaching. A moment where her unraveling would be complete, and I would retain every ounce of my dignity and control. It was a quiet Saturday morning when I saw her first real panic. She had called her bank again, attempting to reverse a transfer she believed was entirely under her control. Her voice, usually sharp and self-assured, trembled slightly as she tried to explain the situation. I listened silently from my office, pretending to be absorbed in other work, letting every frustrated word reach me without a hint of reaction. Her confidence had been her armor, but now cracks were appearing. She demanded answers from the bank staff, insisting that she had full authority, yet the system flagged her repeatedly, requiring documentation and verification she couldn't produce. The irony wasn't lost on me. She had bragged about my stupidity and her own brilliance, yet here she was, fumbling helplessly against procedures she had assumed were hers to manipulate. Through the phone, I could hear her sighs and muttered curses. The laughter that had been her default weapon for weeks had vanished. Instead, there were stammers, pauses, and finally, a soft, almost disbelieving, this can't be happening." Her eyes must have been red from rubbing them in frustration. I could see her humiliation in my mind as vividly as if I were there. I made no move to comfort, no call to clarify, no hint of intervention. The silence was deliberate, a mirror of the calm I had maintained from the beginning. Every obstacle she encountered now was a direct result of her own overconfidence and careless assumption that she could control everything. I didn't need to push the world. Guided by her arrogance, and my quiet preparation was doing it for me. I noted each detail: the time of her calls, the names of the bankers she spoke to, the exact language she used to try to assert authority. Each mistake, each plea, each flash of panic became part of my ledger. I wasn't keeping it for confrontation. I was keeping it as a map of control, proof that patience and observation could achieve what anger never could. By the end of that day, she had hung up, defeated and exhausted, with no solution in sight, and I allowed myself the tiniest, almost imperceptible smile, not out of cruelty, but from the satisfaction of knowing the first real step of her unraveling was complete. The storm I had quietly engineered was visible to no one but me, and yet it was already reshaping her world entirely. By midweek, her frustration had grown into near desperation. She arrived at her bank in person, expecting to assert control and manipulate the staff, as she always had. Instead, she was met with a series of formal protocols, identity verifications, and locked accounts that required approvals she couldn't provide. Her confidence crumbled in real time, replaced by visible panic, stammering explanations, and a mounting sense of helplessness. She tried to charm the bank employees, offering smiles and half-hearted threats, but none of it worked. Their eyes, trained to detect irregularities and follow policy, betrayed no sign of her usual sway. Every signature she presented, every demand she made, was scrutinized and delayed. The world she had assumed she dominated was resisting her, and for the first time she was powerless. I watched silently from a distance, unseen, letting every moment unfold naturally. Her calls to friends and legal contacts went unanswered or were returned with cool, detached responses. Even those who had once acted as extensions of her power now refused to intervene. Her network, built on charm and fear, was unraveling without my having to lift a finger. She looked around the bank as if expecting some invisible hand to save her, and I imagined her eyes widening as she realized she was utterly alone. She leaned over a counter, exhaling sharply, trying to maintain composure, but failing. Her face was red, her hands shaking slightly. I could almost hear the silent scream of frustration echoing in the sterile lobby. The bank staff had no idea that I had orchestrated the obstacles she now faced. Everything appeared as coincidence, a natural consequence of bureaucracy. And in that perfect illusion, her sense of control collapsed completely. After hours, she left the bank, defeated and exhausted, muttering complaints under her breath. She had expected an easy path, a seamless domination of the resources she believed were hers. Instead, she faced walls she couldn't break, doors that wouldn't open, and a reality she could neither manipulate nor escape. And all of it had happened quietly, invisibly, under my watchful observation. That night, I reviewed the day's events, recording her reactions and noting the patterns of panic and overreach. I didn't need to confront her directly. Every moment of struggle, every flash of helplessness strengthened the leverage I had quietly built. And in that quiet control, I felt a calm satisfaction, knowing the final steps toward complete resolution were closer than ever, and she would never see them coming. Over the next week, I watched as her world quietly began to shrink. Friends who had once taken her side now kept their distance, unsure of how to respond to her growing desperation. Invitations dwindled, messages went unanswered, and the subtle social support she had relied upon vanished. She had built her confidence on perception and influence, and now both were eroding before her eyes. She tried to maintain appearances, posting carefully curated photos and messages, attempting to project control and happiness. But the cracks were visible, the tension in her smile, the slight tremor in her hand, the rapid pacing of her steps. Even those who hadn't noticed her growing financial obstacles began to sense the subtle chaos surrounding her. Rumors of missed payments and frozen accounts spread, quietly, without my intervention. Every time she reached out for guidance, the responses were curt, procedural, or non-committal. Lawyers were no longer eager to assist, friends were hesitant to provide cover, and colleagues viewed her attempts at influence with thinly veiled caution. Her network, the one she had carefully curated over years, was abandoning her piece by piece. She was isolated, exposed, and unaware that it had been orchestrated so deliberately. She called me twice during this period, her tone now hesitant, lacking the arrogance of weeks before. I answered calmly, offering nothing more than quiet acknowledgement. Her panic was palpable, but I offered no reassurance, no anger, no accusation. Every word I didn't speak became another thread in the quiet trap she had unknowingly stepped into, tightening her world around her own mistakes and choices. I noted the exact moments of her faltering confidence. Each hesitation, each lapse in composure, each failed attempt at control was recorded mentally, not as vengeance, but as confirmation that patience and observation were far more powerful than confrontation. She was collapsing under her own weight, her own arrogance, her own miscalculations, and I was merely the silent observer, the architect of her invisible undoing. By the end of the week, she was a shadow of the woman who had laughed at me on that golf trip. The young lover she flaunted was distant, unsure, sensing instability and vulnerability. Invitations and opportunities had evaporated. She moved through her days like a guest in a life she could no longer fully command. And I, watching quietly from the sidelines, felt the steady, unshakable satisfaction of control achieved without a single shout, without a single confrontation, only patience, strategy, and calm observation. By now, every step she took was shadowed by invisible barriers I had quietly set in motion. Transfers she tried to make were delayed. Financial advisors hesitated to act without full documentation, and her social connections had grown distant and wary. She believed she had the upper hand, yet every move was already anticipated and neutralized. The quiet control I had exercised for months was now absolute. I didn't need to speak to her. confront her, or reveal my awareness. Silence had been my most powerful weapon. Each obstacle she encountered appeared as coincidence or bureaucratic necessity. Every growing frustration, every faltering attempt to regain authority was the natural consequence of choices she had made without foresight. She was learning, far too late, that arrogance carries a weight invisible until it becomes unbearable. The young man she had introduced into her life grew impatient. He had expected ease, charm, and dominance, and he found none of it. He distanced himself subtly, retreating from a woman whose veneer of control was crumbling. Her influence had shrunk to a fragment of what she had once wielded effortlessly, and she had no idea the calm figure orchestrating it all remained entirely hidden from view. I began reinforcing my own position quietly. Legal documentation, financial oversight, and subtle communication with institutions ensured that every piece of leverage I had built would remain secure. Nothing flashy, nothing visible, only precise measures that guaranteed long-term stability and ensured her inability to reclaim what she had taken. The quiet patience of months was paying dividends I could have never achieved through confrontation alone. She tried to fight back, of course, calling friends, making desperate inquiries, attempting to intimidate bankers and advisors. Each effort was met with delays, polite refusals, or procedural checks she could not circumvent. Her panic grew in private, a silent storm that no one could see, and the red rim of frustration around her eyes became permanent. Each misstep she made further cemented my control, achieved without a single raised voice or confrontation. By the end of the month, I leaned back and observed the final pieces fall into place. She had lost her grip entirely, her social and financial influence fractured, and the illusion of victory she had clung to had evaporated. I didn't gloat, I didn't celebrate, I simply recognized the quiet truth. Control had been restored, integrity remained intact, and the calm, patient strategy I had followed had delivered the outcome I had envisioned from the very first call. The morning after the final bank review, I sat in my study and breathed deeply. The storm that had raged silently around my life for months had finally settled. She had lost her grip, her network had evaporated, and every obstacle I had orchestrated quietly was now complete. I didn't feel triumph in anger or spite. I felt calm, grounded, and in control, the satisfaction of long-term patience finally realized. I thought about the laughter she had used to mock me, the cruel words she had delivered over the phone, and the confidence she had flaunted. Those moments no longer held power over me. I had met betrayal, not with rage, but with observation, patience, and precise action. And in doing so, I discovered something deeper than revenge: self-respect, clarity, and quiet strength that no one could take away. She reached out one final time, her voice trembling. I responded with calm acknowledgement. No anger, no pity, no gloating. Every word I didn't speak reinforced the truth she had failed to recognize. She had lost control entirely. The realization in her silence was the ultimate confirmation of my strategy. I hung up, and for the first time, I felt completely free. The following days were ordinary, yet richer than any ordinary life I had lived before. I returned to morning coffee on the balcony, walks in the park, and evenings of quiet reflection. I didn't need to rebuild what she had taken. I had already reclaimed it in ways that mattered: my dignity, my independence, and my peace. The world moved on, but I had crafted my own version of reality, one built on patience, insight, and quiet action. I kept the ledger of her mistakes, her panic, and her unraveling tucked away. Not for leverage, not for display, not for revenge. It was a reminder of what happens when arrogance meets meticulous patience. It was proof of the power of calm observation over fury, of precision over impulse, and of long-term strategy over short-term satisfaction. It was my invisible victory. And so I sat in the quiet of my home one evening, watching the soft glow of lamps illuminate the room, feeling a serenity I had never known before. The betrayal, the panic, the collapse, all of it had been transformed into wisdom and freedom. I was whole, I was in control, and I was finally at peace. The world she had sought to dominate could crumble without my intervention, and I could simply live, calm and free, knowing that patience and strategy had delivered everything I truly needed.